Hi, everybody. Another short video about ancient Greek accentuation. This follows up on the WTF is up with Greek accentuation video from before, where I tried to simplify things and show how if you look at Greek accentuation from both a syllabic and a morayic point of view, that things get simpler. And in that video at the end, I sort of casually mentioned that if we went one layer deeper, we could see that actually the two different kinds of patterns that I laid out there are underlyingly really the same. And that's what I'm going to go through right now. So ancient Greek recessive accentuation, all accentuation shows this kind of variability. And there are four possible accentual word shapes in Greek. Three, this is from the earlier video, three have a 3-2 pattern, one has a 4-3 pattern. And that is a reference to where the recessive high tone is, and also where the so-called intermediate docking site, which is going to be one mora to the right. So if recessive is on mora 3, then the intermediate will be on mora 2. Same thing, 4 to 3. But if you look at it from the perspective of the pitch contour, the whole pitch contour, these can actually be seen to be doing exactly the same thing, even though if you look at them, they look different. So the pitch contour is what the Greek accent actually is. We tend to think of it as the high tone, but the contour has two parts. That high tone, which is on one mora, and a falling to low drop in tone that begins on the very next mora after the high tone, and it will extend to the next syllable boundary, and I'll show that in a second. So the pitch contour shows up in recessive and intermediate accentuation, but it doesn't show up in terminal accentuation where there's an H, but because the word ends, you don't have a drop. So at the very end of a word, if you have the first mora, mora 1 with the high tone, it doesn't actually have a contour, but all other accentuation situations have it. And the pitch contour shows up in three related variants. In the first, if you have a long vowel and the high tone happens to be on the first mora, the leftward mora of the long vowel, then what you end up with is that the falling to low part of the contour happens on the very next mora. And so you can see this, and that scenario is definitely marked because the accent mark is going to be a circumflex, and that shows you that the high tone and the falling to low tone occur on the same vowel. The high on the leftward mora and the falling to low on the rightward mora. They can also be split between two syllables, that is, between two different vowels. And I've given you the two possibilities here. One is that that next vowel only has one mora, like in logos. So that ultima os, that gos syllable, is only one mora. So the high tone is on lo, and then you get gos, and then you have the falling to low occur on that mora. But if that second syllable has a long vowel in it, like in logu, then you see that the falling to low tone is spread over both of the morae of that long vowel. So that's kind of all you need to know. There's not a lot of complexity here. High tone on one mora, the very next mora begins the falling to low, and it will run through that whole vowel. So if the vowel happens to be long, it'll be spread over the two morae. So in the last video, I talked about the fact that there are really only so many ways to arrange four morae in three syllables. When we're thinking about recessive accentuation, we have 3-2 shapes. The green here is the recessive H position, and you'll see that in the 3-2 shapes, as expected from the name, it's on the third mora from the end. In the 4-3 shape, it's on the fourth mora. So we look at these and we think of these as two operating in two different ways and leading to two different results, the ones on the left, the one on the right. But that's what I'm going to talk about now. These are actually doing the same thing when we look at it from the pitch contour perspective. So here's another way of thinking about the recessive position. The recessive position for the high part of the pitch contour is always the leftmost position in a word that still allows the second mora from the end to be part of the pitch contour. And if you move it one mora to the left of that, mora 2 will no longer be included. And so that is not a valid position for recessive accentuation. So if we take a look at this pattern, what we see is that we've got Mora 3. The high tone is on Mora 3, and then the falling to low tone occurs on Mora 2, which is exactly what we want. If we moved the high tone one Mora to the left, then the falling to low tone would only occur on the second mora of the A syllable at the beginning of it, leaving out mora 2. So this is not possible. And this is the underlying origin for rules like, in this case, what this violates is the rule that most first year Greek students learn, which is that you cannot have a circumflex on an antepenult, on the third syllable from the end. Why? It's really because you would end up in a situation. It's not that it's just a random rule, an arbitrary rule. It's that we're no longer covering the second mora from the end with the pitch contour. And that is what sounded good to a Greek. It's what sounded natural to a Greek. Same thing in this shape. This is another 3-2 shape. We have the high tone on the epsilon, on the mora and the epsilon. And so the falling to low tone begins on the very next mora, mora 2, and then it continues on to the second mora of the omega. Great. If we put the high tone one mora to the left, mora 2, as you can see, would then be excluded because the falling to low tone would occur completely over that epsilon. So that is not allowable. That's not a good accentuation. That's too far to the left. The final 3-2 pattern, exactly the same thing. It works perfectly with the accent here with the high tone there, but if you move it one mora to the left, you end up with a violation. Mora 2 is no longer covered. And again, we've got here another example of a rule that you've probably learned. You cannot have a circumflex on a penult like this if the last syllable is long, like it is here. But the origin of it is this pitch contour coverage that we're looking for. So why do 4-3s work differently? They don't work differently. They work exactly the same way. Here you see anthropos, the high tone, is the furthest left where it will still cover the second mora. The falling to low occurs across that whole omega, including the low on the second mora from the end. Great if we moved it one more syllable over, or one more mora over to the left. And I have to add a syllable here and use the adjective philanthropos to show you this. If we moved it one more left, you see the mora 2 is excluded from the pitch contour. That's really what's happening here. And that's why I can say that 3-2 shapes and 4-3 shapes are really doing exactly the same thing. So really quickly, regardless of whether it's on mora 3 or mora 4, the recessive docking site for the high tone is the furthest left in the word that it can be that still allows mora 2 to be part of the falling to low part of the pitch contour. That means that 3-2 shapes and 4-3 shapes are really doing the same things in terms of the placement of the whole pitch contour in recessive accentuation. One thing that I didn't mention in the previous video, and I've kind of avoided saying, is in actuality, word forms that end in a xi or a psi don't behave exactly like all others. So these rules don't apply to xi and psi. Ending words. These are relatively low in terms of their proportion in the Greek language, so you don't really have to worry about it very much, but I just wanted to mention it here so no one later on thinks that I omitted it because I sort of didn't realize it. But I just want you to be aware of it. Maybe in the future I can talk about how those words work a little bit differently. Anyway, I hope I have shown you all recessive accentuation in Greek is exactly the same. If you look at it not just with both syllables and mori, but also thinking about the complete whole pitch contour and not just the high tone.